Richard Branson entered the world on July 18, 1950, in Surrey, England. From the very beginning, his path seemed different from most children around him. He grew up in a supportive family that encouraged independence and resilience. His mother, Eve, was adventurous and creative, always pushing her children to solve problems on their own. His father, Edward, was a barrister who provided stability and quiet strength. This balance between discipline and freedom would shape Richard's spirit in profound ways. Yet, in the classroom, Richard faced challenges that few understood. He struggled with dyslexia, a learning difficulty that made reading and writing a daily battle. While other students breezed through lessons, he stumbled over simple words and often felt embarrassed by his poor grades. Teachers told him he was lazy or not bright enough, labels that could easily crush the spirit of a young child. But Richard refused to let these judgments define him. Deep inside, he sensed that intelligence was not limited to schoolwork. He believed he had talents that traditional education failed to measure. Richard's dyslexia forced him to think differently. Instead of relying on textbooks, he sharpened his imagination, creativity, and people skills. He became a natural communicator, often focusing on big ideas rather than small details. By the age of 16, he had decided that school was not where his future lay. He dropped out with one clear belief: he was meant to create his own path in life. While many thought this was the end of his story, it was only the beginning. Leaving school without qualifications seemed risky, but Richard carried with him two qualities more valuable than grades: courage and determination. Those traits would soon lead him into his first entrepreneurial adventure, one that would change the course of his life forever. At just 16, with no diploma and little money, Richard Branson decided he was ready to take a risk. He wanted to give young people a voice, a platform to express their thoughts and challenge the world around them. Out of this vision came Student, a magazine created entirely by and for students. It was a bold idea, especially from someone who had just left school, but Richard believed that young people deserved to be heard. He started small, working out of a church crypt in London with a handful of friends who shared his enthusiasm. They had no business training, no publishing background, and almost no resources. What they did have was energy, creativity, and persistence. Richard spent hours calling companies, convincing them to buy advertisements for a magazine that didn't even exist yet. His charm and determination worked eventually. Enough businesses agreed to take a chance on him. In 1968, the first issue of Student was published. It was filled with interviews, music reviews, and articles on social issues that mattered to the younger generation. Richard even managed to secure high-profile interviews with people like John Lennon and Mick Jagger, which gave the magazine instant credibility. Though it wasn't a huge financial success, it was a start, and more importantly, it gave Richard a taste of what he truly loved: building something from nothing. The magazine also taught him invaluable lessons. He learned how to market an idea, how to negotiate, and how to take rejection without giving up. Every setback was a stepping stone, sharpening his instincts as an entrepreneur. Most importantly, Student proved to Richard that even with no formal education, he had the drive to create opportunities for himself. The project might not have made him rich, but it opened a door to something bigger, an idea that would soon launch the Virgin brand and change Richard Branson's life forever. While Student magazine gave Richard Branson valuable experience, it wasn't enough to sustain him financially. He needed a way to generate income while still staying connected to the youth culture he loved. That's when an idea struck him: selling records by mail order. In the late 1960s, music was exploding, but records were often expensive and not always easy to find. Richard realized that if he could offer cheaper prices and deliver directly to customers, he could fill a gap in the market. With the help of his friend Nick Powell, Richard launched his first business under the name Virgin Mail Order Records in 1970. The name Virgin came from the fact that they were all beginners in business, starting fresh without experience. The idea was simple but powerful: advertise records in student magazine and deliver them by post at a lower cost than shops. Orders began pouring in, and soon Richard was making enough to keep the business afloat. But Richard wasn't content with just mail orders. He wanted a space where people could come and experience music. So, he opened his first physical Virgin record shop in Oxford Street, London. The shop quickly became popular, not only for the cheaper prices but also for its relaxed, friendly atmosphere. Unlike other stores, customers could hang out, listen to records, and feel part of a community. This small shop was the seed of something far greater. Richard saw that music was more than a product, it was a movement, and he wanted Virgin to be at the heart of it. His willingness to try new approaches and challenge traditional ways of doing business set him apart from other entrepreneurs. Still, Richard's journey was far from smooth. The mail-order business nearly collapsed after postal strikes delayed deliveries, and the shop barely survived its early years. But Richard's determination carried him through. These struggles prepared him for his next big leap, the creation of Virgin Records, a company that would soon change the music industry. By the early 1970s, Richard Branson had his record shop running, but he wanted to go further. Selling other people's music was one thing, creating and producing his own was another. With his natural ambition, he decided to launch his own record label, Virgin Records. At just 22 years old, Richard was stepping into a business dominated by giants, but he had never been afraid of starting small. Virgin's first big breakthrough came with an unlikely artist, a shy, little-known musician named Mike Oldfield. Oldfield's music was unusual, an instrumental album called Tubular Bells that most record companies had rejected. Where others saw risk, Richard saw opportunity. In 1973, Virgin Records released the album, and against all odds, it became a massive hit. Tubular Bells stayed on the UK charts for over 5 years and sold millions worldwide. Even more, it was used as the theme for the horror film The Exorcist, giving it international recognition. That single success transformed Virgin from a struggling startup into a serious player in the music industry. Soon, Virgin Records began signing major artists who wanted the freedom and creativity the label promised. Over the next few years, stars like the Sex Pistols, Phil Collins, Culture Club, and Rolling Stones joined the Virgin family. Richard's label became known for its boldness, rebellion, and willingness to give unconventional musicians a chance. But success didn't erase the struggles. Richard had little experience managing contracts, distribution, or legal battles, and Virgin often came close to financial collapse. Yet he learned quickly, and every risk he took expanded the brand's reputation. For Richard, Virgin Records was not just a business, it was proof that thinking differently could break barriers. The shy boy once dismissed as lazy had built a company that challenged the music industry itself. And this was only the beginning of Virgin's journey into the wider world of business. By the early 1980s, Virgin Records had grown into one of the most successful independent music labels in the world. Most people in Richard Branson's position would have stayed in that lane, enjoying the rewards of the music empire they built. But Richard was never one to stay comfortable. He wanted to push boundaries, and soon his attention turned to an entirely new industry, air travel. The idea for Virgin Atlantic Airways came almost by accident. Richard once found himself stranded when his flight to the Virgin Islands was cancelled. Instead of waiting helplessly, he hired a plane, borrowed a blackboard, and wrote, "Virgin Airways, $39 to Virgin Islands." He filled the plane with other stranded passengers, and the idea sparked something bigger in his mind. Why not start his own airline? It sounded insane. Competing against aviation giants like British Airways seemed impossible for a young entrepreneur with no background in airlines. Friends and advisors warned him that the risks were too high and the industry too cutthroat. But Richard saw opportunity where others saw obstacles. He believed he could create an airline that was fun, customer-focused, and affordable. In 1984, Virgin Atlantic officially launched with just one second-hand Boeing 747. To attract attention, Richard made bold marketing moves like offering luxury touches on board, free ice cream with meals, and entertainment that airlines had never considered before. Passengers loved it, and Virgin Atlantic quickly gained a reputation for being different, daring, and fun. Still, success did not come easily. The airline faced financial struggles, fierce competition, and even a dirty tricks campaign from British Airways aimed at destroying Virgin. Yet, Richard's resilience and creativity kept the airline alive. Once again, he proved that daring to dream big and refusing to give up could turn the impossible into reality. As Virgin Atlantic started to grow, it entered dangerous territory, challenging the dominance of British Airways, the flag carrier of the UK. For decades, British Airways had controlled the skies and was not prepared to let a young entrepreneur with one plane threaten its empire. What followed became one of the most famous corporate battles in aviation history. Virgin Atlantic's early success, with its friendly service and fresh approach, made passengers flock to the airline. But British Airways saw this as a direct threat. In the late 1980s, they launched what Richard Branson later called a dirty tricks campaign. Virgin staff discovered that BA employees were calling Virgin customers, pretending to be from Virgin, and telling them their flights were cancelled, then rebooking them onto BA flights. Journalists critical of Virgin were also pressured, and private information about Virgin's operations was leaked. For most entrepreneurs, this kind of attack from a giant competitor would have been devastating. Virgin Atlantic was still small and fragile, and Richard risked losing everything. But instead of retreating, he decided to fight back. He sued British Airways for libel and damages, determined to protect his company's reputation. The legal battle was long, exhausting, and incredibly risky, but Richard refused to let fear or intimidation win. Finally, in 1993, Virgin won the case. British Airways admitted fault, issued a public apology, and paid Virgin damages of around £3 million, which Richard shared with his staff in what became known as the BA Christmas bonus. The victory was not just financial, it was symbolic. It proved that even a young company could stand up to a giant and win. The battle against British Airways solidified Richard Branson's image as the underdog who never gave up. Virgin Atlantic emerged stronger, with customer loyalty at an all-time high. Richard had turned adversity into one of his greatest triumphs. After the hard-fought victory against British Airways, Richard Branson's confidence soared. Virgin Atlantic had survived one of its toughest challenges, and now he was ready to push the Virgin brand far beyond music and airlines. Richard was never interested in building just one company, he wanted to create an empire of innovation, fun, and adventure. Through the 1980s and 1990s, the Virgin Group expanded into dozens of industries. There was Virgin Mobile, which brought affordable phone services with a playful image, Virgin Trains, aiming to improve rail travel in the UK, Virgin Cola, which dared to take on Coca-Cola and Pepsi, and even Virgin Bridal and Virgin Cosmetics. Some of these ideas thrived, while others failed spectacularly. Virgin Cola, for instance, couldn't compete with the global giants and quickly disappeared. But Richard never saw failure as defeat. To him, each failed venture was a valuable lesson about markets, branding, and timing. Richard's philosophy was simple: if Virgin could make an industry better for the customer, then it was worth trying. He built his reputation on risk-taking and challenging big corporations, which earned him admiration from many and skepticism from others. Journalists often joked that Virgin was entering too many fields, but Richard believed variety was the secret to growth. What made Virgin unique wasn't just the products, it was the brand spirit. Virgin stood for fun, rebellion, and accessibility. Whether it was trains, planes, or phones, Richard wanted customers to feel like Virgin cared about them more than the competition did. This people-centered approach helped Virgin win loyal supporters across the world. Still, managing such a vast empire wasn't easy. Some businesses drained money, while others thrived. But Richard's boldness and optimism kept him moving forward. For him, the adventure of building and risking was as exciting as the profits themselves. For Richard Branson, success was never just about building companies or making money. Deep inside, he had an explorer's soul. He believed that life should be lived as an adventure, and he constantly sought challenges that pushed the limits of human endurance. For Richard, daring to dream big in business was no different from daring to cross oceans or skies. It was about courage, risk, and discovery. In 1987, Richard, along with Swedish adventurer Per Lindstrand, set out to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a hot air balloon, something no one had done before. The journey was terrifying. Storms battered the balloon, equipment failed, and the freezing cold tested their endurance. Yet after days of uncertainty, they landed in Ireland, setting a world record. 2 years later, the duo attempted another daring feat, crossing the Pacific Ocean by balloon. Against enormous odds, they succeeded, flying from Japan to Canada in the longest balloon flight ever recorded at the time. These achievements thrilled the public and made headlines worldwide. Richard was no longer just the eccentric businessman behind Virgin, he was now an adventurer who embodied the spirit of boldness. Each expedition symbolized his philosophy: it's only by being bold that we truly discover what we're capable of. But not all adventures went smoothly. Richard faced crashes, near-drownings, and brushes with death. In one attempt, his balloon plunged into the sea, and he was rescued by helicopter just in time. Still, he never allowed failure or danger to deter him. To him, failure was simply part of the journey toward success. These adventures brought global attention to the Virgin brand, but they also revealed something deeper about Richard Branson's character. He showed the world that true success is not measured by money alone, it is measured by the courage to take risks, embrace challenges, and live life to its fullest. By the late 1990s, Richard Branson had already transformed the music, travel, and telecom industries. But his vision stretched far beyond Earth. Ever since childhood, Richard had been fascinated by space exploration. He remembered watching the Apollo 11 moon landing in 1969 as a teenager and thinking, one day, ordinary people should be able to go there too. That dream, decades later, became the foundation of Virgin Galactic, a company dedicated to making space travel accessible to non-astronauts. In 2004, inspired by the success of Spaceship One, the first privately funded craft to reach space, Richard announced Virgin Galactic's mission: to build commercial spacecraft that would take paying passengers on suborbital flights. Many laughed at the idea. Critics dismissed it as a billionaire's fantasy, too risky, too expensive, and too far ahead of its time. But Richard believed that space tourism was not just possible, but inevitable. The road was anything but easy. Engineers faced endless technical challenges, delays, and rising costs. In 2014, tragedy struck when a Virgin Galactic test flight crashed in California's Mojave Desert, killing one pilot and seriously injuring another. The world mourned, and many expected Richard to give up. Instead, he grieved with the families, supported his team, and doubled down on his dream. "Space is hard, but it's worth it," he said firmly. Years of setbacks followed, but Richard's determination never wavered. Slowly, the spacecraft improved, safety measures strengthened, and progress was made. Then, in July 2021, the moment finally arrived. At the age of 70, Richard Branson himself boarded Versus Unity, Virgin Galactic spaceplane, and soared more than 50 miles above Earth. Floating in zero gravity, he gazed out at the curvature of the planet, tears welling in his eyes. His lifelong dream had come true. For the world, it was a historic milestone, A businessman who had once struggled with dyslexia and doubts was now officially a space traveler. For Richard, it was proof that no dream is too big if you dare to pursue it relentlessly. His message was simple yet powerful: we are here to make the impossible possible. Richard Branson's life journey is not just the story of a billionaire entrepreneur, but of a dreamer who refused to be defined by limits. From a boy struggling with dyslexia to the founder of more than 400 companies, from crossing oceans in balloons to soaring into space, Richard's life is proof that passion and persistence can overcome any obstacle. What sets him apart is not only his daring ventures but also his philosophy of leadership. Richard always believed in putting people first, whether employees, customers, or communities. At Virgin, he built a culture where fun, creativity, and kindness were as important as profit. He often said, "Train people well enough so they can leave, treat them well enough so they don't want to." This approach made his teams fiercely loyal and turned Virgin into more than a brand; it became a family. Beyond business, Richard used his influence for good. Through Virgin Unite, his charitable foundation, he has worked on global issues like climate change, poverty, and healthcare. He consistently reminds others that success without giving back is incomplete. His campaigns for clean energy and environmental sustainability also show his forward-looking vision, not just for profits, but for the planet. Today, Richard Branson is admired not only as an adventurer and entrepreneur, but as someone who shows us what's possible when you live boldly. His legacy isn't just Virgin or even Virgin Galactic; it is the belief that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things. His story teaches us that fear, failure, and doubt are not barriers, but stepping stones toward greatness. Richard Branson's life reminds the world: dream big, take risks, embrace failure, and never stop exploring.